words as an introduction. So we are here on the first webinar, what is a seminar or webinar series powered by EIT Health and carried out by Tartu Biotechnology Park, and also with the support of the Scanbalt network. And these organizations are all supporting health innovation on a local and also on a European level. So EIT Health Network is the largest health innovation network in Europe, with approximately 200 members from different stakeholder groups. Tartu Biotechnology Park is a science park and cluster organization that supports health innovation and life science innovation on the Estonian level. And Scanbalt Network is a similar organization that it's a meta cluster or cluster of clusters with partners from around Baltic Sea region. We have Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, Denmark, and Holland. And the aim of this network is to support the development of Baltic Sea region as a European hotspot, but why not also a global hotspot for health innovation. And the aim of today's webinar is to start discussing about support that we can provide for mental health, and especially for early stage mental health entrepreneurs who are looking for some kind of support in the form of either an acceleration program or in otherwise, and start discussing these topics that would be relevant for mental health innovation as well. So mainly at this stage, as we are currently mapping and developing this program, it is in the early piloting phase. So we are testing out some of the topics that would be relevant for general health application developments. So that's why we're starting from the security and GDPR topics today, and you can check the rest of the schedule of the webinars on our website in biopark.ee, for example, but it's also been published in Facebook and in our LinkedIn. And the aim is to test or to talk about these topics and to get feedback from early stage and also a bit more developed companies in the mental health area about whether these topics are relevant and what aspects should be more or less discussed. And for today's seminar, we have two speakers for you. We have Yash and Rohit, and they will open up these topics of the first webinar. So without much further ado, I would give the floor to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. So I'll just start sharing my screen, and I think we can begin with the GDPR topic, and then I think Rohit can take over for the security aspects of it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, just. So I hope you guys can see my screen.
Yes, it's well visible.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so the topic is, as you already know, for the first session in this webinar series is mental health and the GDPR. My name is Yash Kaushal. I am an Indian citizen and a techno-legal privacy professional currently in the Netherlands with a work ex of 4.25 years in the privacy and data protection domain. And here are my LinkedIn contact details. So to begin with now. Yeah, so we'll begin with the basic definitions in the GDPR. So first of all, of course, the name is General Data Protection Regulation. So without mentioning data, it won't be fair on the regulations part. So first is personal data. Now, any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, and here natural person is called the data subject throughout the regulation. So that is personal data, the definition of personal data. Now, as we see, the important aspect of it is that whether the individual could be identified, then also it relates to personal data, or if it could be identifiable in future also, it is personal data. So both of these aspects, and it is not only if one data attribute relates to an individual and identifies the person. It can also be if a person can be identified using a combination of multiple data attributes. So all those attributes could be considered personal data. For instance, even company name and email ID, right? Like, for example, Yash at xyz.com is, even though it's a business contact email ID, but still, because you can identify me as a person in the company, that also is considered personal data. The other interesting definition is processing. Now, processing of personal data is governed by GDPR. Now, processing stands for any operation or set of operations performed on a single set of data or a set of data attributes. All of it comes under processing. For example, any operation under the sun could actually be considered as processing. For example, altering, modifying, retrieving, transferring, transmitting, deleting, modifying, all these operations are considered, even viewing for that matter is considered processing under the GDPR. So the definition of processing also is very interesting because it hardly leaves any scope for any operation to not be called as processing. Then the third definition is of controller. I might use this term later on in some of the slides. So controller is the entity of the natural person which determines the means and purposes of processing of personal data. And that the primary responsibility lies with the controller, of course, because it is the entity which determines the means and purposes of processing of personal data. And therefore, there are so many of obligations under the GDPR which directly apply to the controller. Then processor is another entity under the GDPR which helps the controller to perform certain operations or do some part or all of processing on behalf of the controller. So those entities are called processors. Of course, there are certain obligations which also directly apply to processors in the GDPR. But those obligations specifically will not be discussed as part of the presentation. The other interesting definition is pseudonymization. Now, pseudonymization is the technique where the processing of personal data is done in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific individual without additional information. Now, the most important aspect in this definition is that the person is not identifiable or identified without the combination of other data attributes. So for example, if I mask one data element, and store the other data elements in a different location, right? So that masked data element will not identify me, let's say, as a person. So that will be pseudonymized data. But because if it is combined with other data elements and leads to identification of an individual, it is called pseudonymized. It is and not anonymized. It is not complete de-identification of all the data attributes. It is not stripping of all the attributes which lead to identification of an individual. And lastly, quickly, the personal data breach as per GDPR is basically, it's a breach of security leading to accidental loss, alteration or modification of personal data, or unauthorized disclosure of personal data. So of course, security aspects will be dealt with later on in the webinar. Now moving on, let's see quickly look at the scope of the GDPR. So there are two scopes of GDPR. Interesting thing is, one is the material scope and the second one is territorial scope. So the material scope is processing of personal data, and the territorial scope is any processing happening within the European Union, by any controller processor established in the Union, is considered to be taken in the scope of GDPR. Any processing of personal data of data subjects in the Union also will be considered of the scope of GDPR, provided there are services or goods offered to such data subjects in the Union, or and it does not mean that they necessarily have to pay for it. It could also be a free service, but because the service is being provided to data subjects which are in the Union, then also GDPR applies. For instance, if there's an Indian company or an American company delivering products to people in the Union, right? So they would need the name and contact details of people in the Union. So because they're offering some goods or services, delivery services, the GDPR also applies to such entities. So that's why the scope of the GDPR is extraterritorial. It is not restricted within the European Union. I hope that that's clear. So now we move on to the common data protection principles listed in the GDPR, and these are widely recognized in many different data protection laws in the world. So first is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, which is about being transparent in terms of what could happen with your data, what type of processing will happen, or what are the entities with whom the data will be shared, and how are we going to delete the data, for how long are we going to process the data. So all these communication, transparency related obligations come in the lawfulness, fairness, and transparency principle. Then the second principle is purpose limitation. Purpose limitation means that data has to be processed only for the purpose, for the specific purposes which have been identified, and only for that purpose, and nothing more. It should not be that we communicate something to the end user, let's say of an app, a mental health app, and we do n number of other things which we don't communicate to them. So purpose limitation is processing only for the limited specific purpose, and that is all. Third is data minimization, which is also very important. Data minimization means we should only process and use that much data which is required for us to meet our purposes or business requirements. We should not collect unlimited data or whatever we think is appropriate, and we just start collecting and processing data. We should only collect the data which is absolutely required to meet our purposes of processing. Then the fourth principle is accuracy. It means that data which we process should be accurate. Of course, there should not be any inaccuracies. It should be updated, kept up to date, and maintained in the repository. The fifth principle is storage limitation. So this means that the data that we process, right, it is limited in storage, in the sense that the period for which it will be stored should be quantified and limited. It should not be like we collect the data and we hold it for 100 years, because we certainly know that the data will not be relevant and we won't be performing the services for continuously for so much of time. So there should definitely be, it should not be infinite storage. There should definitely be some quantification or limit on the storage period of data. The sixth principle is integrity and confidentiality. So this can also be called as security, where we try to maintain the integrity of the data. We have to ensure that the data is not leaked, it is not altered, or there is no unauthorized access to it, and it is confidential. It is between the end user and the controller, and if processes are involved. So it's a very close knit and tight mechanism of access, and protected environment should be given to processing of personal data. Then this last principle is accountability. This is the latest principle which was added in the GDPR, the directive, the data protection directive before GDPR, which was active, did not include this principle. All the others were there. So accountability means all these compliance with all these six principles has to be demonstrated by the controller. So the principle of accountability, the onus or the burden of proof is on the controller uh, to demonstrate that they have been complying with the requirements of the law. Now, moving on, we come to a special set of definition in the space of personal data. These are specifically mentioned in the GDPR and are regarded as a sensitive or special category of data. Now, these are limited to data revealing philosophical beliefs of a person, data about trade union membership of a person, data about genetic information about a person, biomedical, medical health data, data revealing religious inclinations of a person, and also the sexual orientation of a person. So because of the sensitivity of these data points, and these are specifically defined in a different article in the GDPR, and of course, because these are sensitive, there are certain more caveats, certain more protections and safeguards required to be provided for processing such personal data. Yeah. Now, mental health in the context of M-Health apps. So with the ubiquitous use of mobile devices and tablets, right, and the growing need to have handheld devices, we must believe that there is potential in these apps to improve the cost and quality of healthcare, right? They can also help in reducing the stigma and increase the treatment, make it more accessible to people all over the world, even remote locations, right? And there are certain advantages, definite certain advantages in using mHealth apps, right, and making it available for people to use. They can also act as self-monitoring symptoms and behaviors. They can act as standalone self-help programs, which can be used in a standalone environment, or also could be used in conjunction with government guided programs, which could be provided via website, right, or direct contact with a healthcare professional. So certainly there is a need to have these, right, because they provide a global accessibility to a lot of people who require uh, to be helped in this way, right? So, but there are, of course, certain risks and ethical considerations which we have to look at. Because it's a digital environment, there is always a possibility of theft, loss, or malfunction of the mobile device. Of course, because these mHealth apps process a lot of sensitive information, personal health information about people, right? So this is of great value for cyber criminals. For instance, they can use the data to obtain medical services. They can use the data and to obtain to bill insurance companies in the name of ghost services in the victims' names. So there is a lot of potential for the cyber criminals to exploit this data. Then, of course, fraudulent events that happen, right, might lead to inaccurate data of mental health information. And once that information is mishandled, it could greatly affect the future healthcare and insurance coverages of these individuals. So there is a lot of things which can go wrong, specifically in the context of health information because of the sensitivity. Then erroneous mental information can also influence a person's social circle. They can be stereotyped. They can be people can judge them at workplace. So there can be a lot of stigma to it, right? I mean, we've already seen people uh, having biases against people with neutral genders, and so on and so forth. Then the last point is disclosure of identifiers to third parties, such as IMEI, UUID, and IP addresses. So usually these identifiers may not be tricky or may not create a problem for general apps, but for mental health apps, mHealth apps, it is particularly sensitive because people don't even want others to know that they're using these apps, right? So there is a lot of because of the sensitivity of the issue and the data, this should be regarded and given special care and extra protection in terms of data processing. Now, moving on, we see there is a term called data protection impact assessment or privacy impact assessment. I'm sure most of you would have heard this in the context of GDPR, and there are many laws coming up with these types of assessments. So this assessment, it's an important component of an app's accountability that comes under the GDPR. Article 35 of the GDPR lays the ground and the criteria to conduct DPIAs for systems, processes, applications, specifically when they involve a special category of data such as health data. Now, performing the PIA or DPIA enables companies to assess the risks in advance, of course, before going live or before rolling out their systems in production. It enables them to assess the risks, take prior steps to mitigate them, and then maybe with the residual risk and acceptance from the stakeholders, they can actually go live. They can go in the production environment. So it enables the companies to prepare in advance. And of course, if the risk does not go away, right, and even after the assessment, there are steps to which they cannot do to mitigate the risk. Then there is another set of obligations that they need to notify the data protection authorities, and they have to consult. Such companies have to consult the data protection authorities, and then accordingly they have to implement those recommendations and then go live. Now, regulations such as the GDPR, they encourage the publication of these PIA reports because it adds to the trust factor, right? People, if they know that, okay, these things have been taken care, the project has undergone critical privacy analysis, then it sends a message to the community and the public in general. It reinforces the trust, and people then start believing in the product that you have delivered. So this is one very important aspect to be taken care, especially in the context of mL apps. Now, commonly perceived challenges are, the most important issue is that there is a lack of research evidence on the potential efficacy or effectiveness of apps in the mHealth sector. So empirical analysis and investigation and evidence and data. So all of these uh, lack generally, even if there is either the sample set is too biased or it is too small to arrive at a definite conclusion, right? So there is a lack of research evidence in the whole. Then the second point is that healthcare professionals generally seem to be less experienced on how to evaluate and use these apps. And older healthcare professionals may also they might be intimidated by the use of new technologies, right, and mobile technologies. So they may be less inclined to use these technologies. Similarly, older clients may find it difficult to use and interpret the information which is provided to them by the mHealth apps. So these are the commonly perceived challenges in this domain. Now, general unethical practices are, these are highly prevalent at any given point in time, even now after, I think, 4 years of GDPR enactment. So privacy policies are hard to read. This is a very generic, common problem across sectors, not only mHealth. Even if we take banking websites or any app for that matter, privacy policies are, there is so much of so much of legal language that a normal layman person cannot understand, and the length of the document makes it even hard to understand what's going on, what will happen with the data. So there are so many things which are written in fine prints, so that the user intentionally, they're written in fine print so that the user misses out on those details. And so those are cryptic privacy policies. This is one of the most common problems. The second one is that usually the apps, right, these M apps, M health apps present unfair clauses. For example, there are two most common: contract by using and unilateral change. So contract by using means we all would have encountered, I think, websites where they drop the cookies to track your device and to maintain the session and all those things. And they start with the sentence that by using our website, you agree to the usage of cookies, right? So this is unfair because the user does not know what is being dropped on the device, on the device browser, how how much tracking will be done, what all data points could be collected, and how a profiled analysis could be done about the individual or the device. So it is unfair, and it is untransparent, and it is unethical. The second one is the unilateral change, where there are so many apps that you would have seen, which start with as soon as you open them, you would have seen that okay, I agree uh, to the terms and conditions. So it is, and then it is irreversible. Once you give the consent, or you press the I accept button, then it's a unilateral change which is irreversible. You cannot go back and withdraw your consent, which is also a regulatory problem as per GDPR, because consent once taken should always be as easy to give and as easy to withdraw, right? So these problems are, of course, we understand that developers try to make the user experience very seamless, but certainly we have to have a balance between privacy, compliance, and user experience. So that has to be further investigated, and there should be uh, uh, intentional effort made in that direction. Now, moving on, the current state of health apps. So recently, I think in January 2022, this year, an Australian research was done in Australia, taking 27 of the top most downloaded and used highly rated apps with a rating of +4 stars and downloads of minimum 100K downloads on the Android App Store. So from that study, the findings were very interesting. For example, only a small number of apps were actually designed, and these are mHealth apps. Only a small number of apps are designed by healthcare professionals, and a large number of apps were developed by other institutions, which are actually not related to healthcare professionals nor to the medical fraternity in any way. And only a small number of apps had a strong research evidence in terms of the database that they used to come up with outcomes and analysis uh, of the patient's mental state. Then the other common problem is that there are actually no measures or certifications to guarantee that the apps recommended by healthcare professionals, it provides a sufficient safeguard in terms of privacy and data protection. So there is no common global certification point to this regard, where we can clearly say that, okay, these apps are certified and it is certain that they provide additional sufficient safeguards. Then the common problem with most apps was with regards to linkability, identifiability, and detectability threats. And some of the authors of the research, they tried to contact the developers of these apps and inquired about the PIA reports if they did any privacy impact assessments. So some of them, only a few of them actually responded, and fewer had made the PIA reports public. So which is a disturbing thing in the sense that the trust is enhanced when you make the reports public, right? And of course, you should. It does not help people, right? If you have not done a PIA, especially in the context where the data or the information that you process is so sensitive, and it affects people in a very vulnerable group of individuals. Continuing on the same, so 88% app privacy policies were found to require at least college level education to understand. So you can understand the level of language and legalese which was put in drafting those privacy policies, the complicated ones. And 74% of these apps were at critical security risks, and 14.8% of apps at high security risks. So some of them were transmitting data in plain text, which is not secure. The passwords were being exchanged and transmitted online in plain unencrypted text. So those were putting real risk to individuals uh, whose data was processed. Now, if we continue, there are certain recommendations that I think organizations, software developers, and end users and healthcare professionals uh, can do and implement. So organizations can, of course, undertake a privacy impact assessment. Even if they don't do a full-fledged privacy impact assessment, at least they should attempt to do it and understand the risks that the processing of personal data puts forth to the individuals. Then, because of the sensitive category of information that these mHealth apps process, they should assume that mental health apps are a high-risk category system or apps. Then, of course, while designing these apps, the companies and organizations should engage with security experts, privacy experts, and of course, healthcare professionals as well, because that helps with making the data for analysis more well balanced, right? And then lastly, write readable privacy policies which are transparent and open, and really understandable, even to a child. Forget about college level education. Now, software developers, on the other hand, can actually, the recommendations for them is to connect the privacy policy to the system's design. Although we understand that the privacy policy is a sort of legal document, and developers and coders don't have direct engagement with the privacy policy, but they should attempt to understand what goes on and what is communicated in the policy. And of course, they should get in touch with lawyers to make corrections if required, right? Because privacy policy is actually a commitment to the end user in this way. Whatever is written is is a word of stone, set in stone, and the company cannot go back on its words, right? So, if required, and if the developers find something inaccurate, they should get it corrected by getting in touch with the lawyers. Then they should engineer privacy by design and by default. By this, I mean to say that uh, data minimization as a principle and as a concept should be engraved in the app from the starting, from the commencement or the ideation phase. It should not happen that once the app is ready, then you're trying to build in the privacy features, because then it is not privacy by design. So privacy and data protection by design has to be embedded in the system from the stage of ideation. So minimum data has to be collected from the very start. And engineers, of course, they should also try to think whether there is certain functionality that they can provide uh, without collecting additional data points or making the user login. These days, there are quite many apps which come up with a guest mode feature to let people use the feature without collecting additional data. And the last point in this regard is collect valid consent with responsible onboarding. For instance, we understand that there could be a slight friction in onboarding the user into the full experience of the app. But you must understand that this is very important to collect valid consent from people, especially in a special category of data, because that's where the companies have to rely upon the legal basis for processing sensitive health data is explicit consent. So explicit consent has to be explicit. It cannot be hidden by a simple I agree button. So that needs to be understood. And lastly, for end users and health practitioners, I would recommend that stand up for your rights. Stand up for your rights of access to data, stand up for your rights to rectify your data, delete your data, get your data ported if required. So stand up and know your rights, of course. GDPR provides for at least 6 to 7 rights that you can exercise. Of course, these rights are not absolute. There are certain caveats to it. There are certain exceptions to it. But know your rights and stand up for them if required. Don't just take companies on their word. If you feel that there is certain unlawful processing happening, then stand up for your rights. Set up, raise a request, data subject request with the company. If the companies are not responding, then you can also lodge a complaint with your respective data protection authority. And of course, for healthcare practitioners, they should know the reputable apps which they are recommending for mental health. They should not recommend apps which primarily are selling their own products, or whose funding is basically based on advertising regime. Because in those apps, certainly there will be some sort of sharing with third-party data brokers or entities, and God knows what happens with the data. So health practitioners should be very safe and very cautious in terms of recommending any apps to their patients for mental health. Then what more could be done? See, developers have to understand that the technology can be used to provide better tools for making it more productive therapeutic alliance in the health domain. They should focus on certificating the quality and accuracy of mHealth apps. People should come up with courses that will train mental health professionals in using mobile technologies. The mental health professionals should feel familiarized with such technologies, right? And of course, the mental health professionals on their part should contribute constantly to the growing body of evidence. It could be psychiatrists, it could be medical professionals, doctors. All these should contribute constantly to the growing body of evidence, because that is what, from the back end, from a database standpoint, is required to come up with accurate predictions and even more accurate solutions to the problems of patients. Now, moving on, I'll just briefly discuss one example. It was a privacy breach of mental health data, which is very relevant in our webinar. So last December, there was a company called Vastamo, which was issued a fine by the Finnish or Data Protection Authority of Finland. So Vastamo is a Finnish private psychotherapy clinic. What it did was it stored health data of its patients electronically. So even the notes and the prescriptions written by the doctors, right, and the uh, and the medical people, they were written, and the soft and digital copies were backed up by the clinic. Now what happened is a hacker stole the patient records and partially leaked it over the internet. Now the records impacted over 30,000 individuals. And the problem was that the data breaches were only reported by Vastamo to the authorities and to the data subjects 1.5 years later, after they became aware about the breach. So of course, GDPR lays a timeline on companies to notify and report its data breaches. So the timeline is as strict as 72 hours as soon as you become aware. And here we see that they took 1.5 years after they knew that the breach has happened. And especially when the breach involves patient records in a mental health scenario, it's a special category of data. So what happened was that the Data Protection Authority imposed fines, but I would like to emphasize the factors which they considered in evaluating the fine. So these are some of the factors, not all. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the factors were that the clinic neglected its duties related to data security. Even the basic security checks were missing, and basic security parameters were not implemented. There were no procedures, no access protocols which were adhered to. Second point is that they lack the documentation to demonstrate compliance. So like we discussed, the principle of accountability, right? The onus is on the company or the agency or the clinic in this case to demonstrate that they complied or they tried to comply to the best of their knowledge with the law. But they'll even lack the documentation to support and demonstrate their compliance. Then, like we discussed, they intentionally fail to notify in time about the breach to its customers and the authorities. And lastly, the data breach involved, of course, compromise of special category of data. And of course, the number of records also, which was 30,000 records of 30,000 individuals. So 30,000 individuals plus the number of records pertaining to each individual. So that is a huge amount of data which has been breached and leaked over the internet. And maybe it could be up for sale on the darknet, or it could be used for ransomware, as we see in these days. Uh, so these are this is what is happening in the current state of mental health domain and apps, and these are the pointers that we could take away. So I would like to conclude and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Yash. This was very good presentation. So many thanks for opening up those specific issues as well, when we're talking a little bit more about specifically about mental health app developments. And specifically, I was sort of kept on thinking about how there are no actual standards how to approach which apps are good and which are not that good. And definitely the GDPR and security part plays a strong role in there. So this has to be included in that as well. There are many guidelines which the reimbursement organizations are sort of following, and one of the more developed and more familiar one or known one is the DIGA framework, which is used to evaluate the suitability of health apps to reimbursement and also for treatment purposes. So but this is a work that is still ahead of us. Do we have any comments or questions from the audience at this stage? Yes, Andrea, please.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. It is very interesting for me. Can you give me any research evidence, or can you give me public available research about which was the main reason that 74% of apps was in critical security risk? And yeah, so this topic interested me. So can you give me any references, because I didn't see any sources in your slide?
Sure, Andrea. So I can provide you with I refer to a paper which was published this year, and the paper did mention about the criterion for doing the investigation. It was an empirical analysis of 27 shortlisted apps, and they did mention the criteria for selecting those apps and what went wrong, and how did they arrive as to these percentages. So they had mentioned 24 out of 27 apps were the privacy policy of 24 out of 27 apps required college level education, and then they had also defined the parameters for considering the app to be at critical security risk and then at high security risk. So there is distinction. I can of course provide you with the paper later. You can maybe reach out to me on my LinkedIn, or maybe I can in the chat I can write my profile link, and I'll share the PDF with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It will be great. Thank you.
Okay,
Yes,
thanks.
I also noticed that this was a rather interesting study, so I will also check that out later. Do we have any other comments or questions at this stage? If not, then thank you so much, Yash, for this presentation. And we're moving on to Rohit. Rohit, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sven. Thanks, Yash. Interesting conversation around the whole privacy aspect in GDPR and how and what companies and people who are making apps or using apps or recommending apps should be going through. So my conversation will be revolving more around the technical aspects of what all a developer should do, or a company who is developing this app should take care of. And in case there are more people from the other domains, what should they be looking at and what kind of questions they should be asking their team to keep the things secure in their environment. So that would be my conversation. To start with, that's my profile. I've been doing cybersecurity for the last 20 years now. I've been helping a lot of organizations as virtual CISO these days, which is the virtual Chief Information Security Officer for them. I've been recipient of Microsoft Most Valuable Professional Award for Enterprise Security. Currently helping a lot of cybersecurity startups as well in securing their infrastructure and going right with their applications once they are launching it. Parallelly, I help Department of Science and Technology in Government of India as well for a lot of activities. That's my credentials, the email address, the Twitter handle, and my direct cell phone number in case somebody requires that to get in touch. Without further ado, we'll discuss about, or rather, I would skip this part because this is very well covered by Yash, that healthcare app, once they are broken into or an attacker finds a vulnerability in that, it can be a treasure trove for an attacker. And what as a developer one should do to make sure that the attack possibility is reduced significantly. And that's what is more important. You should reduce the attack surface of your application so that the return over investment for the attacker is not very lucrative when it comes to your app, so that they can move on to something else and leave you around. It doesn't have to be killing a mosquito with a cannon, but still make it difficult for the attacker so that you are on a safer front. So today what we'll be doing is we'll be discussing 10 things to remember while building a healthcare app, and specifically a healthcare app. There are other, most of the security controls would be applicable for almost everything, but it would become even more important in case of a healthcare application. So we'll start with the first one, the data storage approach. What all you should be doing when it comes to the data storage of your app. The first and foremost recommendation is avoid storing any sensitive data on the device. The device is not in your hand. The device is not in your control. So as a developer or as an owner of the app, you should primarily think of a situation that the application data should reside on the server, and as and when needed, it should be fetched and used. The processing can happen if you require this end device to process the data. That processing can happen, but strongly recommend to delete the data when not in use from the mobile devices, because you are not aware of the endpoint device, what kind of system it is, who is using it, is it being used for legitimate purpose or not. So keep it as minimal, leave it for the processing and remove it once the processing is done. In case this is unavoidable and you have to have the storage on the phone only for certain reasons, and it could be dependent on different applications and different use cases. If you have to store, make sure it is encrypted. Do not store the data on the end device unencrypted. Then not only on the mobile front, but on the server side as well, be very careful about the leakage of sensitive data. And there we have seen a lot of issues which developer tend to lose out on the haste of publishing the app or oversight, that they accidentally capture a lot of sensitive data on different platforms, like the application log itself, share that data with third parties, the keyboard cache itself, where the phone cache memory could have a lot of private information, so you have to avoid that. And then the user device during the interaction. So make sure that the exposure to that data is minimal outside of your server side. And even on the server front, make sure that you know where the data is getting stored. If it is in a database, let it be there, but it should be inside a database only. Let not any private information go to the application log. We have seen interesting cases of these kind happening. One was even with Twitter, where the database, the log system was logging in people's username and password, although not a regular healthcare app, but yeah, there are cases which you have seen of this nature, which happens. Then second would be the API strategy. That should be something which is very important and carefully taken care of. Mobile application per se do not work alone. They interact with the backend server of it. And most of the cases, the communication is over APIs or the application programming interface. Make sure your APIs are secure. Be extra cautious if you're using any third-party API. A lot of third-party APIs are very actively being used by a lot of developers, something for crash analysis or something for application analytics, where the user is clicking or not clicking, or what kind of page of the application the user is spending more time. Good for your analytics purpose, but remember, once you are using any third-party API, you're actually exposing the data to that third party as well. So make sure you are exposing minimum and on a need to know basis only. If it is not required by that third party to function, do not share it. Use some kind of an API gateway, which will help you protect your API and attacks. See, what happens is once you're creating an enterprise application, you can always define that, okay, my client is in, say, this particular office, my server is in this particular data center, allow traffic between only these two places. The moment you come out to a mobile application, anybody could be accessing your mobile application from anywhere. And for that, attacker is also open to attack. Hence, you have to make sure that your APIs are protected using API gateways. Have some kind of central authentication server. Logged in user also. And what I mean by that your application might have a mechanism for a username and password to log in. That's fine. That's given that people would do that. But once the authenticated app is also creating a connection with the server on API, make sure that the particular connection string is also validated, so that you are aware that it is a legitimate request from a legitimate app which is coming to your server and not a random attacker trying to get access into your systems. Moving forward, third would be the validation. Make sure that you validate the data entered on the first point of data collection itself, which is the mobile application. The entry of any malicious content in it, it could be the user entering in their profile or maybe asking a question or any of those stuff. If there is a malcrafted string in the data entry, that will affect both security as well as usability and formatting of the application. What happens in such cases is if you miss the validation, the attacker can execute a code remotely on your device or on your server and thus exploit the system. Example, like if it is a numeric field where you're asking the person to enter a phone number, why do you need a alphanumeric value? It is only the numbers which is needed. Or if it is a email address, why do you need anything apart from alphabets, numbers, @, dot, and maybe a few underscore? You would not need any other special character required at those kind of a validated field. So make sure those strict controls are implemented and the validation is done. And then anything which is high risk character, and you would get this from a lot of security content around what are these high risk character and why are they high risk character. Avoid using any of those, or rather filter it out from the user input as soon as possible. That's where the front-end validation is required. But that's not sufficient alone. You would require a back-end validation as well. The server-side control also is required. See, these days application is not only a client-side operation. It's not a, and when you're talking about a healthcare app and a mHealth app, we're talking about a client-server operation. There would be something on the client side. There would be something on the server side. Close interaction would be happening between these two. In such a situation, do not depend only on a client-side validation. Make sure that it is revalidated on the server front, and that's how the things will become more secure. Server side is very important, irrespective of the channel by which the data is coming to the server. Mostly it would be coming from mobile application, but because it is exposed API, there could be a web request, or there could be some another request as well. Make sure all the data is checked and sanitized on the server front also, along with the client side. And just remember, because you're hosting it on some cloud, it is not automatically a secure stuff. You will have to configure the security to make your application and the server secure. Next would be encryption. Encryption is very, very strongly recommended in the whole case of any healthcare app. It might not be very relevant for a regular app. Maybe the Facebooks and the Instagrams of the world may not be needing that kind of encryption. But for a healthcare application, encrypt everything, including files, database, credentials, and irrespective of their storage. It could be stored in a database, it could be stored in a file, it could be stored in a keychain or a key store. Make sure they are encrypted and maintained. Plus, the keys which you are using for encryption should also be encrypted and should not be stored insecurely. You cannot lock the house and leave the keys under the footmat. So make sure that the encryption key is also secure. Then whatever you are installing on the end device, and maybe an Android or an iPhone, the installation file should be obfuscated so that the reverse engineering attack is controlled. Make sure during the processing, you are not downloading the decryption key from your server to your end device. If any decryption is required, make sure that the decryption is happening on the server side, and then the data is transmitted over a secure socket layer SSL or a TLS, or as we commonly know it as HTTPS. Make sure that the communication is happening over that secure channel, but security key, the encryption key, the key which is used for decryption, should not be traveling to the end device. That's an important one. Obfuscation is something which is needed. Strongly recommending the code obfuscation. And what happens with that is, you may not even be aware of it, but it's a known fact that you can go ahead and download the app from an app store or a Play Store, which is not on your phone, but on your computer. And you can run programs to convert the application into source code. So it's not only source code to application, from application to source code is possible. Once you do that, the logic, the storage, the mechanism, all of that would get exposed. So make sure that you do not have any secret information in the mobile source code. It could be in the on the server side only. There should be no secret usernames or password or stuff like that on the mobile application. And the logic is obfuscated so that the reverse engineering of that application is difficult. If you have script files along with the application file and stuff, make sure that all of that is obfuscated as well to keep your application in safe environment. Strongly coming on to the permission side, what I've seen is people love to take permissions on application. That, okay, give me permission of maybe access to your contact, access to your SMS, maybe making a phone call. Unless until you require that permission for the application to work, do not request for a special permission from the user. It is not only a security issue, but it's also a trust issue. The moment you find an app which is asking too many permissions, people have a lower trust on those applications. That, oh, this application is being too intrusive. So the recommendation is take minimum and see that is there a possibility of giving the functionality without asking for the exact permissions. Do you have that capability that you can give out that kind of functionality and not ask that particular permission? So let's take an example. Access to SMS. A lot many apps take access to SMS to do an authentication that, okay, we will be sending you one-time passcode onto the cell phone on your SMS, and we will automatically read your SMS and put in those keys so that you don't have to take an effort. From the ease and usability part of it, it's very good. But then it is a big risk from the security point of view. The authentication is happening once in a while, but access to SMS is going always on. So at the end user, people always have this fear that, oh, because you have access to my SMS, you're not only looking at an OTP which was meant for your application, but you're also looking for other information coming over SMS. It could be my banking information, it could be another OTP. So the user may have a level of uncomfort if such things are asked. Access to contact, and specifically while talking about an mHealth kind of an application, people tend to and want to keep this information very, very private and close to them only. They don't want this to be informed to everyone in their contact. So the moment your application asks access to contact, an inherent fear comes in that, oh, why do you need the access to the contact? At any given point of time, will it be possible by the app maker, or to an extreme, will it be possible by an attacker to get into this and send my information to my contact? So not only from a security risk perspective, but even from a trust value, minimal permission is the key. You should be focusing on as less as permission as possible. Then I'm not sure if it is relevant in your cases as well, but a lot of people are really worried about making their app available on a phone which is rooted or a jailbroken. What does that mean is the security control installed by the manufacturer, maybe Android or maybe iOS, the security control is bypassed because you have a higher privilege access into that phone just because you have rooted it or jailbroken it. A lot of people use these kind of devices because what they achieve is more control on the phone. But remember, if you are getting more control on the device, so are the attackers. And in such a cases, a lot of app makers do not want their app to run on a rooted device or a jailbroken device. I'll come to that in a few moments. Now, if it is not possible to store on the server and you have to store it on the device, make sure that you do not, or rather at least you go for a check. And there are applications and scripts available which can check whether the end device is rooted or not. So you can come back and validate whether the device where the application is getting installed, is it rooted or not. If it is rooted, raise a warning accordingly and tell them that, boss, this is an insecure practice. Please do not have your phone rooted or jailbroken. And if you want to, then we won't be able to support the application on that particular device. Tavi has a question. What if I keep all data on phone locally? So I run my services on the server, but data from the user database. Very, very unrecommended practice, Tavi, in that case, because ultimately your data is on a device which is not under your control. Your servers are under your control. If it is absolute personal data, you can still leave it on the phone and not take it, because then you are maintaining the level of bifurcation with that data. But the problem is, in case the phone is compromised, all of that data is also going to get compromised. And when I mean, when I say phone getting compromised, it is not only the physical theft, it could be also a malware on the phone, a virus on the phone, which can look at the data and reuse that data. So it is not recommended to keep the private any data onto the end phone. If that is one of the requirements, then one aspect can be played around is have it encrypted. The decryption key is on the server. You decrypt the data in the runtime, let the user use the data. The moment the application is closed, the data is encrypted again, so that attacker has minimal possibility of accessing that data. Okay, moving on. Make sure that you have some tempering protection enabled in your application. See, there are two ways of making an app. Either you use the native code and build an app natively for each platform, or you use a cross-platform application framework. If you use a cross-platform application framework, this thing will be taken care of. But if you're using a native application from scratch afresh, then you will have to take up care on this particular aspect of it. What is it? What happens is the APK or the IPA, APK for the Android or IPA for the iPhone or iOS devices, they can be downloaded. We spoke about that, but they can be downloaded, altered, and republished in different markets, not the actual Google Play or Apple App Store, but alternate marketplaces. There are different alternate marketplaces from where applications can be installed. So this can be pushed there, and malicious activity can be supported from that side. It is very well possible to crack in-app purchases and license check by emulating what the store is responding. So attacker creates a fake store, so to say, and responds in the same manner what was expected from the actual App Store or Play Store, and cause a fake sense of satisfaction that the app is working fine. But in-app purchases can be cracked that way. Also, there should be some mechanism to check the application integrity if it is coming in from a third-party server. What does that mean? That means the digital signature of the file which have been published by you should be validated on the server side, so that you know that it is a legitimate app which is not altered or tinkered around with by an attacker, which is communicating with you. So your API call can protect it here, that okay, if an application which is created by us only, when it is talking to the database, I will have a double check and validate whether the communication which is happening is from a legitimate source or not. That integrity check is an important one. And last but not the least, you should get a thorough security check of the application. It is not the developers' work to know and complete this thing on their own every time. They may be aware of it, but make sure that you have a third-party independent vendor who is evaluating your code, checking for the security, and doing an assessment of your platform. Regular code evaluation and analysis around any security holes left around should be done. And as I said, preferably it should be done by a third-party independent player. While you have started thinking of making an application, make sure that the security team you have is involved from day one. And if you do not have a security team, at least you have onboarded a security consultant who's helping you out from the legal perspective and from the technical perspective from day one, that, okay, this is what you are trying to make, this is how your application is going to be. How would you take care of it from the design stage itself? Because as a proverb says, a stitch in time saves 9. If you have a right approach done at the beginning of the code development or even the ideation of the application, your further expenses on security would reduce because you have already taken care of the aspect early on. So start planning the security method. And whenever you are planning a major change in the application, make sure you talk to your consultant or your security team that this is what we are planning as a pivot or as an addition in my platform. What other security risk does this brings us to? That would be one of the important aspects, and should be, or rather the consultant or the security team in that case would be in a position to warn you at right moment that, okay, you are trying to look into this particular aspect. Suppose you are expanding your geographies and trying to take the app into some other market, then which other laws are applicable? What other security controls would be needed? All of those can be brought in by a qualified security team for you during the application. To end with, just to let you know, yes, making a secure app is difficult but not impossible. Right efforts can bring it there. And that's it from my side. This is one of the books which I had authored about the same topic, where you would understand what an end user, when he picks up a phone in his hand, should do to make the data secure, and what do they expect from an app maker. So maybe it will be helpful for people who want to learn more from an end user perspective. And that's it from my side. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rohit.
Very
exciting overview of as a side joke. I was actually hoping 11 pointers based on your handle, but so 10 was also perfectly fine. So many thanks. Very nice overview. So very several technical aspects that have to be considered were very nicely provided here. So this provides a clear overview. Do we have any questions or comment at this stage? So you already replied to one of the questions in chat, so I'm not going to take that up again, but if there's anything else, then it's a good time to ask or comment. If not, then it was a great pleasure, Rohit, to have you with us, and you, Yash, as well. So I'm quite sure that we're going to keep in touch. This was the first webinar in the series, and at one point we're trying to bind it all together, and we're going to see where it goes to in the next year. Hopefully, we're able to go a little bit deeper with the whole proposed let's say support program next year, and hopefully we can find new roles for there as well. So, but we'll see that in the new year. Thank you so much.